Charles Oliveira is the story of a kid who started from nothing with no real chance. Born in a favela, he was struck by a severe illness that could have left him unable to walk, yet he defied the odds. Today, that same man holds the record for the most submission wins in UFC history, and he's admired by all. A legendary finisher who overcame every obstacle. He embodies resilience and audacity. This is the incredible story of Charles du Bronx Oliveira, an MMA icon who climbed his way to the top. Charles Oliveira was born in the favela of Vicente de Carvalho in Guarujá, Brazil, a place where poverty and violence are part of everyday life. At just 7 years old, everything changed. He was diagnosed with severe rheumatoid arthritis and an abnormal heart murmur, a condition that attacks the joints, causes constant pain, and threatened to leave him unable to walk. He spent the next 2 years in the hospital. His mother, Ozana, a housekeeper, stayed by his side day and night. She slept on the floor, often going weeks without returning home just to be there for him. His father, Francisco, worked in a slaughterhouse and sold eggs at the local market to provide for the family. Despite the heavy treatments, weekly injections of benzathine, benzylpenicillin, and constant pain, Charles held on to hope. And against all odds, 2 years later, he walked out of that hospital determined to live his life to the fullest. At 12 years old, Charles was introduced to jiu-jitsu thanks to Paulo, a neighbor from his neighborhood who believed in him. Paulo bought him his first gi and took him to a small academy in Guarujá. Just 2 months after starting, Charles was already winning competitions. But his illness was still there. He had to undergo heavy treatments every week until he was 18. Charles trained alongside his brother at the Bronx Gold Team. His first coaches were Jorge Macaco, Patino, a Brazilian MMA legend, and Erickson Cardoso, both of whom saw great potential in him. However, training was expensive, and his family couldn't afford it. That's when Paulo stepped in and arranged things with the coaches so Charles could train almost for free. Charles is deeply grateful to Paulo. In an interview, he called him like family. Sadly, Paulo passed away just 2 years after introducing Charles to jiu-jitsu. He never got to see all the success Charles would achieve. Between the ages of 13 and 17, Charles won many important competitions, both in lightweight and openweight categories. Even from a young age, his technique, speed, and determination stood out. It quickly became clear he was on his way to becoming a real rising star. While he was already shining in jiu-jitsu, Charles began turning his attention to a sport booming in Brazil, MMA. It was during a training session at the legendary Shoot Box Academy, the same gym that produced Anderson Silva, Wanderlei Silva, and Shogun, that the transition became obvious. On the 3rd of November, 2007, he had his first amateur fight and wrapped it up in just 15 seconds with a slick armbar. 3 months later, he turned pro, and his debut couldn't have gone better. At Predator FC, he fought 3 times in one night and finished all 3 opponents. He then went on a tear through various local promotions, and the results were always the same, finish after finish. In his first 12 professional fights, he remained undefeated 11 of them by submission or KO. He was dismantling everyone, and the UFC took notice. On the 8th of August, 2010, at just 20 years old, Charles Oliveira made his UFC debut against Darren Elkins. He submitted him with an armbar in the first round, then followed up with another highlight submission over Efrain Escudero. But the rise wasn't smooth. His momentum was cut short when he suffered his first defeat, submitted by Jim Miller. Then came a no contest after an illegal knee, and in his next 5 fights, he won only 2. Every time the UFC gave him a real test, he stumbled. He got finished by veterans like Donald Cerrone and Frankie Edgar. It was a tough stretch. Doubt started creeping in. In 2015, he looked like he was back on track until he faced Max Holloway. That night ended in another loss, stopped in the first round. The weight cuts were getting brutal. So in 2017, he made a big decision: move up to lightweight. At that point, Charles had a UFC record of 10 wins and 8 losses, not the kind of record you'd expect from a future champion. But everything changed. In June 2018, he fought UFC veteran Clay Guida and finished him in style. That fight marked the start of a complete transformation. From that moment on, Charles Oliveira would go undefeated for 5 years, a streak of 11 straight victories, and almost all of them finished before the final bell. After Guida came Christos Giagos, then Jim Miller. This time Charles was the one submitting him. David Tamer, Nick Lentz, Jared Gordon, one after the other. He put them away. Submissions, knockouts, always with style. In March 2020, Charles faced Kevin Lee, ranked, explosive, dangerous. But Charles shut him down, took him to the ground, wore him out, and in the third round, locked in a perfect guillotine choke. That night, the MMA world started paying real attention. A few months later, in December, he faced Tony Ferguson, once the scariest man in the division. Charles dominated him. 3 rounds of total control, took him down at will, cranked his arm in a brutal armbar, and somehow Tony didn't tap. It was a technical massacre. At that point, Charles Oliveira had 8 straight wins, almost all by finish. The UFC had no choice anymore. The lightweight belt was vacant, and Charles Oliveira was finally getting his shot at the title. His opponent? The dangerous Michael Chandler. May 15th, 2021. Charles Oliveira steps into the octagon for the fight he's waited for his entire life. A shot at the UFC lightweight title. Across from him, Michael Chandler, former Bellator champion. Explosive, dangerous. Most people think Charles will fold, that the pressure will break him. But then, the fight starts at a furious pace. Chandler lands hard shots in the first round, drops Oliveira. The Brazilian is in trouble, but he survives. He stays calm. And just seconds into the second round, everything changes. Charles lands a surgical left hook. Chandler goes down. Oliveira swarms him, ground and pound. The referee stops the fight. Charles Oliveira is the UFC lightweight champion. A kid from the favelas, written off at birth, now standing at the top of the world. But he's not done. The 11th of December, 2021, he faces Dustin Poirier, the man who just beat Conor McGregor twice. A feared striker, durable, relentless. The fight is brutal. Poirier lands big shots early, but Charles doesn't fold. He stays composed, patient. In round 2, the tide turns. Oliveira drags Poirier into the clinch, lands elbows, wears him down. And in round 3, Charles jumps on his back. In seconds, he locks in a rear naked choke. Poirier taps. Another finish. Another message to the division. But the story takes another twist. May 7th, Charles is scheduled to defend his title against Justin Gaethje. But the day before the fight, disaster strikes. He misses weight by just half a pound. The UFC strips him of the title. He walks into the cage without the belt, but everyone knows what's at stake. The fight is wild. Gaethje rocks him early, twice, but Charles stays ice cold, calm in the chaos. Then, Oliveira fires back, lands a clean right hand. Gaethje collapses. Charles jumps on him, takes the bag, and sinks in the choke. 3 top contenders, 3 finishes, and even without the belt, everyone knows who runs the division. Charles Oliveira is at his peak, a complete fighter, a killer with heart, technique, and experience. But far away, another name is rising, a silent threat. The heir to Khabib's throne, Islam Makhachev.
Hey guys, you can run, but you can hide. I'm coming, I'm here.
After beating Gaethje, Charles Oliveira seemed untouchable. But in October 2022, he faced Islam Makhachev for the vacant lightweight title. That night in Abu Dhabi, he was dominated. Islam controlled every phase of the fight and submitted Charles in the second round. It was a tough loss. Oliveira lost his belt, and for the first time in years, he looked outmatched. But he didn't give up. On the 10th of June, 2023, he returned to face Beneil Dariush, a top contender on a winning streak. In Vancouver, Charles made a statement. He defended the takedowns, landed clean shots, and finished Dariush with a sharp TKO at the end of the first round. It was a dominant comeback, a performance that reminded everyone who Charles Oliveira really is. A rematch with Islam Makhachev was scheduled for UFC 294, but just days before the event, Charles suffered a cut above his eye during training. He was forced to withdraw. The rematch was off. Instead, at UFC 300, Charles faced Arman Tsarukyan. The fight was close. Charles had the edge in striking. Tsarukyan controlled more on the ground. After 3 intense rounds, the judges gave a split decision. 2 scored it for Tsarukyan, 1 for Oliveira. A narrow loss, but Charles showed once again that he still belonged at the very top. A few months later, in August, he stepped into the cage against a familiar name, Michael Chandler. Charles was calm, composed, and in control. Chandler pushed hard in the last round, but Oliveira held strong. He won by unanimous decision. With this win, Charles Oliveira proved that he's still elite. After everything he's been through, Charles Oliveira is back where he always wanted to be, at the very top. But this time the belt is vacant, and standing across from him is a new name, an undefeated phenomenon, the featherweight champion moving up in weight, Ilia Topuria. The UFC wants something fresh, and Topuria is the moment. Young, powerful, precise. He hits hard. He talks louder. And he's aiming to make history as a 2-division champion. But he's not facing just anyone. He's facing Charles Oliveira, the man who submitted Gaethje, Poirier, Lee, and many more. The man with the most finishes in UFC history. The man who once grabbed the title when nobody believed in him, and now wants it back again. This fight isn't just about styles. It's a clash of generations. Fire against fire. And this time, the UFC lightweight belt is on the line. For Topuria, it's a once-in-a-lifetime chance to reign over 2 divisions. For Oliveira, it's a chance to prove he's still the king, not because he was handed the crown, but because he took it himself.